Hello there and welcome to Google Sheets Basics. In this video, we're going to discuss the difference between some counting formulas and how they function and what they do. So first, let's talk about the difference between some of the counting formulas. So we know that we have to do, in order to do a formula, and I'm just going to click over here, we have to do an equal sign and then the count tag. So I'm going to do COU, and you can see here the types of counting formulas. So the first one we have is count, and that counts the number of numeric values in a data set, meaning it counts how many cells are filled with a number. It doesn't add them because that would be the sum formula. It just counts how many there are of numbers. So if you highlight a range of cells, it will count how many of those cells have a number inside them. COUNTA is similar, except for it counts all of the cells that have anything in them at all. So it's just counting cells that have text or numbers or anything at all in the cell. So if you have a range of cells, you are counting the ones that are not blank. So count counts the number of cells that have a number in them. COUNTA counts the number of cells that have anything in them at all. All right, so then the next one we might have is COUNTBLANK. And this is exactly what it sounds like. It counts the number of cells that have nothing in them at all. So it's the opposite of COUNTA. So just to repeat, count counts the number of cells that have numbers. COUNTA counts the number of cells that have anything at all inside of them. And COUNTBLANK counts the number of cells that have nothing in them at all. So they are blank. So those are three count formulas that might be useful. So let's talk a little bit about what we might want to use these formulas for. So let's say I'd like to do some class counting. So I have my class here and I want to see that they all have, I want to see maybe how many students I have in this class, because I want to be able to count percentages, for example. I want to know how many students I have or how many students did this. So I'm going to go down here and I'm going to say, all right, this is the list of my students up above, and I want to count how many there are. So I'm going to do C equals, and then I'm trying to count not just numbers, but cells that have anything filled, because if they have the name in here, I want to count them. So I'm going to do COUNTA. And then we know that we have to put a parenthesis, and then we have to select the cells that we would like to count. So I can either type the range, or I'm just going to click and drag. So I'm going to start at this guy here, and I'm going to drag my range down to the very end. And then we know that we have to put a parenthesis at the end. And then we press enter. So this is telling me that I have 27 total students in my class. All right, super helpful. So then let's say I would like to count. I notice they have a grade level here. And maybe let's say I'd like to count how many of them are seniors. Okay, so some of them are in grade level 12. So maybe I'd like to count how many of my seniors, because I know they're graduating soon and I want to make sure that I pay attention. I want to know how many I have that are seniors. Well, because I don't just want to count if the cell is full, I want to count the cell based on a specific criteria. And this is the last of the count formulas that we're going to talk about. And this is COUNTIF. Okay, so the other formulas just count basic things. They count if it's full, they count if it has numbers, they count if it's blank. COUNTIF, on the other hand, is a conditional count. What that means is it's only going to count things based on a specific criteria that I have. So for example, I only want to count the number if it has a 12 in the grade level, right? I just want to count how many of these students have the number 12 as their grade level. All right, so let's go ahead and work on that. So I did equals COUNTIF, because I want to count the cell if it is a 12. Again, a parenthesis. And as we know, oftentimes the first thing in a formula is going to be the references. So I'm going to count this range here. So that is B2. And then we put a colon to separate a range, B2 through, let's say, B28. All right. Now, here is what needs to happen next. This is the range I want to count, but now I need to tell it what am I looking at to see if they're going to count. So oftentimes things in formulas are separated with a comma. So I'm going to put a comma. Now I'm going to give it the criterion. And remember, if you're confused, you can always go to this little help bar here, or sometimes it will give you this formula help bar that's super convenient. So again, it's going to give you the range, and now I have to do the criterion. So what am I wanting it to count? Okay, I want it to count if the number is equal to 12, right? I want to know how many of my students are seniors, so I want it to count if the number is 12. All right, so I need to put the number 12. So I want it to count. I'm going to put the quotation marks, the number 12. So I'm going to say, all right, I want to count how many appear. I want to know how many cells appear with the number 12. And I use quotation marks because I want the exact number 12. I don't want anything larger or smaller. I just want whoever has exactly the number 12 in that box. So put an ending parenthesis, just like in math and in formulas, we have to end with the parenthesis the same as we start, and then I press enter. So that is telling me that right now I have 6 students in my class who are seniors, who are in a grade level 12. Kind of convenient. Let's talk about another way that you could use a COUNTIF formula. So let's say I have all of these scores here. Okay, so let's say, let's look at column score 6. So let's say score 6, I want to know how many of my students performed below my proficiency target. Okay, so I want to know how many of my students scored below an 80. Right? Because I want to know how many of my students, maybe my proficiency target is 80, and I want to know how many of my students scored lower than an 80. So I know how many students I need to look at some remediation for potentially. So let's look at that. So again, we are wanting to count based on a criterion, right? We want to count them if they scored below an 80 on this test. So I'm going to click in this box here, go up to my formula bar. Again, every formula starts with an equals. And we talked about count, and you notice it's suggesting some options for me. It will do that. So we'll do count if. Let's look at our range. Remember, count if parenthesis. And what is our range for column 6? So column 6, I want to count K2 through K28. So K2 through K28. So that's my range. The next thing I need is my criterion. What am I counting it if? All right, so comma. So now I want to count if the score is lower than an 80. All right, so this again, we need to use some of our math terms, lower than an 80. So count if, and again, I'm going to use my quotation marks here, less than. So I want a number that is less than an 80. Less than an 80, so 79 and below. So less than, we're going to use a less than symbol because we want it to be less than 80. Less than 80. All right, and then we have to close out our quotation marks because we're trying to reference exactly what we want. We want less than 80. And then we close our parenthesis because we must have parentheses before and after our formula. And then we press enter. So that is telling me that out of my class on my final score test, my score 6 test, 12 students scored below an 80. So 80 or below, or 79 or below. So any of those numbers anywhere in here, it is counting them and it is saying less than 80. And you could do it the other way too. So let's say I want to know who scored above an 80, whose proficiency, or maybe I want to say above a 79 maybe. So, okay, now I found out what it was for lower than proficiency. What about higher? So let's go the other way. Let's change it to greater than 79. Now I want to know how many of my students scored greater than a 79. And if I press enter, so 15 students scored greater than a 79. So 15 of my 27 students that we found out earlier scored greater than a 79 on that test. All right, so that is just one example of ways to use the count, count blank, count ifs formulas to count different amounts of cells and get responses based on that. So I hope that was helpful and you can go forth and do some calculations on your own spreadsheets. Wish you best.